listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Federal budget cuts are disrupting the distribution of food to vulnerable communities. We will hear from two organizations in Central Florida who are already feeling the crunch. And we'll travel to the Audubon Park neighborhood to visit a niche store that caters to readers seeking romance in the pages of books. But first, whether it's on something we buy, sell, or own, we all pay some form of taxes. There's a tax that puts the primary financial burden on tourists visiting Florida rather than the people who live here. Money generated by the Tourist Development Tax, or TDT, comes from a tax on hotel stays and other short-term rentals. In Orange County, it's 6% of every lodging bill, totaling more than $350 million in revenue last year. According to the county government, Orange collects the largest share of TDT of any other county in Florida. Here's how Democratic State Senator Carlos Guillermo-Smith explains it.
Hotel taxes are a bed tax that are collected whenever someone stays overnight in a hotel or an Airbnb, for example. And so they're mostly paid by tourists who come to Central Florida and come to the Orlando area.
There's a debate over where that money goes. When Orange County's tourist development tax was enacted in 1978 and approved by voters, the ordinance stated TDT could fund the convention center, tourism promotion, and sports facilities. Florida state law does not allow it to be used for schools, public safety, and general government services in Orange County. This week, Florida Citrus Sports CEO Steve Hogan asked the Tourist Development Tax Sports Incentive Committee in Orange County for at least $10 million. It's to entice the Jacksonville Jaguars to play their home games at Camping World Stadium in Orlando during the 2027 NFL season, while their home stadium, an hour north of Palm Coast, is being renovated.
If this was one game, we'd be asking for probably $3 million of investment from TDT. It's worth it. But we realize the Jags have a few options, but not too many. We think this is the best option. So I think it's a blend between what's fair to us and fair to the NFL and all the owners to look at Orlando and say they've been fair in their approach. They're incentivizing appropriately for the opportunity. And so we didn't go as far as maybe you could make an argument to go in terms of overall asks. So $10 million we think is fair. It's an opportunity to get the job done, and it's fair to the Jags, fair to us.
Steve Hogan told the task force that dollar amount could go up to $11 million if the Jags make the playoffs and play in the postseason in Central Florida. Based on research they did looking at other NFL teams, third-party data, and info from the Jaguars, Florida Citrus Sports put conservative estimates at some $20 million coming back to the region in economic impact per game. Here's Maria Henson, Director of Market Research and Insights with Visit Orlando, speaking at that same meeting Monday.
It is the first opportunity for this destination to host something of this size and prove to the world that we are able to do so and do it successfully. And I think it's not just for the NFL, but for all the sporting events, Olympic level events, anything that, college games, just showing that Orlando can deliver this.
We asked Visit Orlando to talk about the estimates for return on investment. They thanked us for reaching out and passed on our request for an interview. The Tourist Development Tax Sports Incentive Committee granted the funding request to lure the Jaguars to Orlando. Ultimately, the Orange County Board of Commissioners approves TDT uses. On the NFL side, the Jags will make a decision in the coming weeks, and a formal vote is scheduled for the May NFL owners meeting. State law dictates what local governments can use TDT for. But in 2023, Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings established a Tourist Development Tax Citizens Advisory Task Force to get more community input on how the money is used. Eric Gray, Executive Director of Christian Service Center for Central Florida, was appointed to serve on that citizens panel. He joins Engage to explain how he thinks TDT funds could be used to offset burdens that are shouldered by Central Florida residents. He starts our conversation with his reaction to this use of TDT funding to attract an NFL team.
I am entirely in favor of anything that provides the greatest return on investment to the citizens of Orange County. The challenge is no one is measuring the economic impact of any of these investments because they are not legally required to under the statute. And if anybody is coming back from any of these organizations that receive this funding, if they are presenting some type of economic impact forecast, it is something that they have commissioned. And while I trust them and I believe that they are all well intended, I don't think that when you're spending $300 million of tax money, you should necessarily, just trust the people who you're giving the money to say, yeah, this is a great deal. I think you need to use outside independent economists that are totally outside the state of Florida, have nothing to do with the tourism industry. In the same way that I, as a nonprofit, am required to go through a financial audit, every year. I think there are ways for us to look at actually forecasting the ROI for these projects that are tens of millions of dollars of tax revenue. It would be great, and it's kind of a fun novelty to have the Jags here, and I'm a fan, and I love NFL football, and if I could afford to go, I probably would try to go to a game myself. But the question, I think, always has to be responsibly asked, which is, what is going to be the greatest return on investment? If that is a new water sewer system for the International Drive area to make sure that we don't turn into Flint, Michigan and destroy the tourism economy, then that's the greatest return. Let's do that. If it's investing in a new $500 million, ballroom at the convention center, and that shows the greatest return, I'm in favor of doing that too. If it's that we can invest in public transportation in a more effective way, since we have the worst funded public transportation system anywhere in the United States, and that shows a greater return, that's where the money should go. And if it's incentivizing the Jacksonville Jaguars to come here, then that's where the money should go to.
You have said in the past, this is a quote, "Our residents are bearing the burden of a wonderfully large number of tourists, yet we cannot use TDT funds to offset those burdens," end quote. Can you talk about those burdens and how Central Florida residents are shouldering those burdens?
So at a large scale, I think the biggest issue you can talk about right now would be housing. So housing is all a product of what percentage of your income are you spending on your housing. So if you and I lived in the same exact house next door to each other, same floor plan, same size, and you're spending 29% of your income on your mortgage, and I'm spending 31% on mine, I am in unaffordable housing and you are not. And that's a major problem, because 62% of the community is spending more than 30% of their income on housing. There's only one market in the country that's worse than that, and it's Miami. So that's one issue. The other is just real simple is, when you have a million additional people in the community, and you have folks who are, picking up things here and there that they may not should pick up and putting them in their pocket. And so the amount of petty theft crime in the community is outrageous. And I really feel for the Orange County Sheriff's Department, who has to address this on a daily basis. And then when you have any type of medical issue, they're not like they're going to their doctor. They have to call fire rescue. So you have, a pretty massive fire rescue presence that has to be addressed, not only at the hotels, but at the parks themselves. And so you could talk about any major issue of which we spend money on here in Central Florida, and you could tie it back to the fact that tourism can make it better and it can also make it worse. And so it's really up to us to make sure that we are finding the right balance. And I think that needs to include not just the tourism industry executives, it needs to include church leaders and business leaders of other sectors. It needs to include residents.
Thinking about the impact to Central Florida residents, and given the current laws about how TDT funds can be spent, how can TDT funds be used to offset those burdens you were just mentioning?
So I send you your 7 ideas that I came up with some friends of mine, and I think one of the biggest areas would be transportation. The current statute allows for investment of infrastructure in the community beyond attractions or convention centers, but you have to be spending a certain amount of money on marketing and promotion first. And so right now we're spending 30% of the TDT on money specifically with the Convention and Visitors Bureau, which we call Visit Orlando here in our community. That's great. I don't have any problem with that, as long as you can show me the return on investment. If we were spending 40%, then that would actually open up to where the money could be spent on something like the new Sunshine Corridor, which would allow the Sunrail program to go to, of all places, the convention center. And it would allow it to run, 7 days a week and in the evenings. And it would allow you to go to the airport, and all things that would actually, I think, would benefit the community. So there are a number of transportation related projects that I think could be used to improve the tourism sector itself and then free up money that we're spending in the tourism sector now to spend on other things outside of the iDrive corridor. So there are a lot of ideas. I think the most substantial one that I would like to see implemented and would be easiest is the one right now that Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith has in front of the state legislature.
Executive Director of Christian Service Center for Central Florida, Eric Gray, served on the former Tourist Development Tax Citizens Advisory Task Force in Orange County. You heard him mention State Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith's bills. They're focused on cutting TDT funding to Visit Orlando and loosening restrictions on how TDT can be spent. We asked Senator Smith to join Engage to discuss proposals to modernize the way government thinks about tourist development tax spending.
Unfortunately, state law is very strict with how hotel tax dollars are allowed to be spent by local governments. As you know, hotel taxes are a bed tax that are collected whenever someone stays overnight in a hotel or an Airbnb, for example. And so they're mostly paid by tourists who come to Central Florida and come to the Orlando area. But what currently law does not allow for TDT to be spent on is it does not allow for our hotel taxes to be used for workforce housing, for public safety improvements. And most importantly, it's very restrictive on not allowing for counties like Orange to spend hotel taxes on public transit. Connecting the Sunrail train, for example, to the airport to make it be a part of the Sunshine Corridor, which is a visionary project that is going to bring tremendous benefit not only to Central Florida's tourism economy, but also to our local residents, to our workers who will be able to rely on mass transit in order to get to and from some of these large theme park destinations. So we've introduced legislation that really seeks to finally enact much needed reforms on hotel taxes to allow for local governments to spend hotel taxes on community needs, things like workforce housing, public safety improvements, and public transit as well.
So, under this current law, 40% of TDT revenue must be spent on tourism promotion and advertising. Do you think that part of the law should be amended?
That's a crazy part of the law, honestly. A lot of people don't realize this. And when they discover that there is a tiny provision of Florida law with a huge impact that says we must engage in mandatory government spending of taxpayer money on tourism marketing, also known as Visit Orlando, corporate advertisements, basically subsidized by taxpayers, people's heads explode because they don't understand why we would be required to make such a deep investment in tourism marketing the way that we do. 40% of TDT collections, 40% of all the hotel taxes that Orange County receives on an annual basis, by the way, is $140 million. Orange County government does not give Visit Orlando that much money, but the state law says we would be required to do so in order to be allowed to use even a single penny of hotel taxes on mass transit and connecting Sunrail to the airport. That's why I introduced my legislation to change that provision to cap mandatory government spending, if you will, at $50 million towards Visit Orlando for tourism advertising and open up those resources to instead be used on things like public transit and other community needs.
So on Tuesday, the Orange County Tourist Development Tax Sports Incentive Committee approved at least $10 million to try and bring the Jacksonville Jaguars to Orlando to play the 2027 NFL home games for that season while their stadium is being renovated. In your opinion, is that an appropriate use of TDT funds?
Well, it's a allowable use of TDT funds under current law. So if Orange County government decided to put 10 or 11 million dollars in those taxpayer funds to incentivize the Jaguars to come here, they could legally do so. The question is, how much longer are cities and local governments going to engage in this race to the bottom, if you will? Currently, Orlando would be competing with cities like Gainesville, who are also offering taxpayer incentives to the Jaguars and other sports teams to come to use their facilities. And it becomes this race to the bottom of which city is going to give out the most amount in taxpayer money to recruit these teams to come here. Now, there would be economic benefit, just to be clear, and we would see certainly additional ticket sales and concession sales, and there would be an economic impact, and certainly questions need to be asked about how much that economic impact would be. But the broader question here is, isn't there a better use of our taxpayer resources? Shouldn't we be using tourist development taxes to do things like connect the Sunrail train to the airport, make it operate on weekends and longer hours, actually invest in our local community and in destination infrastructure so that we can reach our full potential as a tourism destination? That's why I introduced my proposals in the Florida legislature to reform TDT, because the status quo of giving hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer funds away a year to giant corporations, really in the form of corporate welfare, is just not tenable and acceptable moving forward. Something has to change. We have to invest those dollars in our community to get the most bang for our buck. And at a time where Doge appears to be front and center, a part of the conversation, how do we efficiently spend taxpayer dollars? I think it's important that we Doge organizations like Visit Orlando that receive $100 million in taxpayer funds a year with very little questions asked.
Visit Orlando shared projections that the Jaguar games could conservatively generate $20 million per game for the greater Orlando area. What type of faith do you have on the projected return on the investment?
Well, we'd have to really take a look at exactly what those numbers mean. They could generate that type of economic impact or revenue, but the right questions that need to be asked are, is that revenue going to actually come into Central Florida, or is the economic impact going to be similar if folks just spend that money on a show or going to the movies or going to the restaurant over the weekend instead of going to a sports game? Basically, the question that needs to be asked is, most of those individuals that are going to be attending a game for a Florida team are locals, and we want them to spend their money. But the question that should be asked is, will they be spending the money anyway locally in the community on some of our local entertainment without having to put millions of dollars in taxpayers' incentives on the table?
Bringing it back to your bills on TDT reform, how viable is this? What are you hearing from your Democratic colleagues and Republican senators as well?
Well, these TDT reforms on changing how we use our hotel taxes to invest in community needs really in a meaningful way. These are bills that have been introduced for the first time. I authored these bills during the fall and in the spring of this year because we wanted to get them right. I see our effort as a multi-year effort because oftentimes it does take a while for ideas like this, which, by the way, do have bipartisan interest, to make it across the finish line.
And just to wrap up, are there counties in Florida that are already spending these dollars in a different way or exploring the use of this type of money to fund affordable housing like you were talking about, or workforce housing?
Absolutely. There's not only cities across the country that compete with Orlando as far as being tourist destinations, cities like Las Vegas that invest their hotel taxes in local transit and their schools locally and community needs. But to your point, there's also counties in other parts of the state of Florida where this is allowed. We need to be able to also tap into that in Central Florida and in Orange County, because we can't meet our full tourism potential as a region in Central Florida without investing in destination infrastructure and our community needs. And of course, that is transit, public transit, Sunrail connecting it to the airport, workforce housing, and certainly public safety improvements. That's why we introduced this legislation.
State Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith is a Democrat representing East Orange County. And we want to hear your thoughts about how tourism tax dollars should be spent. Share your ideas with us by email. It's engage@cfpublic.org. There's more ahead on Engage. A new federal funding freeze threatens to take meals off the tables of families in need in Central Florida communities. Hear how our region's emergency food providers are galvanizing their goods and resources to brace for an uncertain future. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, romance literature has matured over the years from the Harlequin romances of airport newsstands to sophisticated takes on interpersonal relationships in the 21st century. So why the growing appeal of this niche genre?
All of these men in these stories have grand gestures that aren't necessarily grand. It's just like declaring your love or showing compassion and empathy or helping them in ways that like maybe women aren't used to. And I think that romance books do a really cool way of showing just how women want to be loved and treated.
We'll learn about the scintillating and satisfying literature at the New Romantics bookstore ahead of this weekend's Romancing the Books Festival in Winter Park. First, this week, our area's largest emergency food provider found out a funding freeze could take millions of meals off the tables of Central Florida families. The Trump administration froze funding from the Commodity Credit Corporation and suspended its orders for the Emergency Food Assistance Program. This includes tractor-trailer loads of food. According to Second Harvest Food Bank of Central Florida, this impacts one of their most important sources of food. Second Harvest says they provide some 300,000 meals a day across 7 counties. If the funding is not available next year, Second Harvest estimates 5.8 million meals will be lost. This will impact their partner agencies as well. Jewish Family Services stocks their Perlman Food Pantry in Winter Park with food they buy from Second Harvest at a reduced rate. Philip Flynn, president of Jewish Family Services of Greater Orlando, joins Engage, along with Greg Higgerson, chief development officer at Second Harvest, to talk about how they're going to handle these changes. Higgerson starts our conversation by explaining the real impact of the federal funding freeze.
For many decades, Second Harvest Food Bank has had as one of our most important sources of food the USDA Government Commodities Program. It's administered through a program called TFAP, or that's an acronym for the Emergency Food Assistance Program. And that is a program that provides millions of pounds of food directly from farmers, that the government buys this food from farmers and makes it available for emergency feeding across our country. It's also one of the most important suppliers of public school cafeteria commodities across this country, in addition to the emergency feeding. So the majority of funding for that TFAP program comes from the Farm Bill that is authorized by Congress. And that has been in place now for years and years and years. It funds not only agriculture, but lots of nutrition programs across the country. And so TFAP is funded by that. A couple of years ago, when demand was really high, the Commodity Credit Corporation was utilized by Congress to fund a supplement to what was in the Farm Bill for government commodities. So farmers were getting more funds to provide more food to get us through an economic time that was very difficult. I know all this is very complicated, but I can tell you that the commodities that we get that were funded by CCC accounted for about 10% of our overall distribution last year. So if that's what we're looking at again, we know that it's going to amount to about 1 million pounds of food that we won't get in the next 6 months, that we know that we're not getting. And that's roughly 900,000 meals for Central Floridians that are facing some real challenges in their personal lives. And so all of that is a very complicated way to say that we've got some really important food that's not going to be coming as a result of this freeze of the CCC fund.
Speaking of that, Greg, how were you notified about that freeze on that community or on that Commodity Credit Corporation funding?
We started to get some rumblings of it about a week ago. We're part of the Feeding America network of food banks, and there are some other food banks around the country in that network that also deal with government commodities who had orders canceled prior to our getting our notice yesterday. But early morning yesterday, we got an email from USDA letting us know, actually from the Florida Department of Agriculture, who um, administers that program in Florida, letting us know that the funding had been frozen, so the food wasn't going to be bought from farmers essentially uh, until further notice. And we just don't know what's going to be happening with that. If it's going to be reinstated at some point or renewed, we just don't know. So we're going to have to make other plans.
Was there a reason given?
Just that the CCC funding was being reviewed. That's a little nebulous, but that's all we've heard. And again, no indication when what the time frame for that might be.
What are you telling your community partners like the Jewish Family Services of Greater Orlando right now?
Right. So we, at the same time that we learned about it, we put out an email to them saying, that this is coming, so that at least that they can start planning to the best of their ability as well, because that's all food that is entirely free to them. There's no fees attached or whatever, and that's going to be a real serious challenge for them because their number of families is not going down. In fact, I think over the last couple of years, they've seen an increase, and I'm sure Phil will back me up. But what it's going to mean for them is that there may be less things like high quality proteins. The things that come from through this program are very important kinds of foods for people that are struggling because they can't. They're the kinds of foods they can't afford on their own. A lot of fresh produce, a lot of high quality protein items, milk, eggs, uh, turkey, chicken, pork, all of those things are purchased from farmers and distributed through our program with USDA. So that we're not going to get 28 tractor trailer loads in the next 6 months that we were expecting is definitely going to have a ripple effect down through our partners. And it's very unfortunate.
And Philip, the Jewish Family Services of Greater Orlando has a food pantry, and you all served more than 18,000 people last year.
This is Phil, and that's an accurate statement. And we serviced 17% more clients in January and February of this year than we did for January and February of last year. So we're seeing jumps in quarterly of at least 15 to 18% going up. It's not abated. In 2024, as an organization, we broke all records of food leaving this house in the 47 years we've been in operation. And this, compared to pre-pandemic and pandemic, it has not abated. It continues to grow. So when we got notified yesterday, thank you, Craig, and I say that with deep respect and love, but it caught. We heard the rumblings also, but when that email came across my screen at a little after 4 in the afternoon, um, we knew the impact was going to be proteins were going to almost be non-existent for us, or that ability to make sure we get those food items out the door. And at the same time that we're reading this, I've got staff saying, our numbers are starting to creep up, and now with this happening and coming into the summer months, which is tremendous for us in terms of support, it's going to be a bit of a storm for us. So we're looking at different avenues to see how we can address it. But at least as of today, probably even as of tomorrow, we'll have no concrete plans in place to be able to provide that sort of support for the clientele that we service.
Phil, can you talk to me about that? Who are the clientele you mentioned? Who are they? They're people in our community. These are families.
These are families, and let me be really clear about that. Do to be really to the point, I'd say maybe 3 or 4% of the folks that show up at our front door for food are what someone would classify as they're homeless. We're servicing families, nurses' aides, teachers, members of force, people showing up at the front door because I mean, this is a whole economic question. Rents have doubled and tripled in Central Florida. Payroll has just not kept up. I don't care what anybody says. Payroll has just not kept up. And so if you've got a family of 3 children and whether you're married couple, single parent, you show up, there's just so far that your dollar can go. And so they make a conscious decision. I need help, and I need help with food. I say this with food. And so they come to our front door. They give us the information that we are required to obtain. A large portion of them come from it's their first time and they qualify under the TFAB program. And so we get them the food out the door as quickly as possible. And they wind up coming back at once a month because they just can't make the dollar stretch. And these are our neighbors. You'd be surprised if you sat here and watched people coming and going, and I'd be willing to bet $1 to a donut that you'll recognize somebody. It's somebody that you never would have thought, but they just can't make the grocery bill, the money that they have in their pocket to go that far to get the aid that they need. And our fear is for the children. I mean, holy mackerel. I say it every time we have these conversations with my colleagues. How is that possible in Central Florida with the amount of restaurants and resorts and tourism industries that we have, that my neighbors are showing up at food pantries and food banks for food assistance? I can't wrap my head around that.
Greg, what is your response to that frustration from your community partners? I mean, you both are trying to do the same thing here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for our part, we were taken off guard by this as well. And our solution is going to have to be to go out and try and buy those things in truckload quantities because it's just not acceptable. The idea that people would just have to go without this as a result. We're looking at maybe $1.5 million extra dollars that we didn't budget for this year to try and just in the next 6 months come up with that protein that people need. If you're sick, you can't heal. If you're a kid, you can't go to school if you don't have the right amount of nutrition and high quality protein. So, that's something that we're going to have to come up with one way or another. We're going to be trying really hard not to let organizations just kind of hang out there as a result of this, but it's going to be an uphill climb for sure.
What workaround do you have? Where do you turn when you hit the wall? You're the safety net for people.
Right. One thing that's important to remember about all of this is that there is definitely an important role for government to play in this. And that has to do with the SNAP program. It has to do with the WIC program. TFAP is certainly part of it. All of that stuff together is really important that we have a strong working relationship together. We are doing the best we can to kind of keep our chin above right now with that relationship. And it's not realistic to think that the nonprofit community can just step up and take over what the government role has been. That's not realistic to think. I mean, we have very generous people across Central Florida, but it's a big challenge.
I wanted to ask you both to respond to the arguments in favor of these cuts, but I'm not hearing that you all were given a reason for why this is happening. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. We the only thing that we heard was that the program, our funding is being reviewed. But that could mean that at some point it's not under review and it's back in force. And if that's the case, we'll rejoice and move forward together with our partners like Phil and his organization. but we just don't have any indication of that right now. So so we're playing. It's a situation of hoping for the best and planning for the worst at this point.
Greg Higgerson is Chief Development Officer at Second Harvest Food Bank of Central Florida. Philip Flynn is President of Jewish Family Services of Greater Orlando. We want to talk about the issues impacting our communities and tell your stories. Engage with us. Here's some ways to get in touch. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org like Lee did to comment on our recent story about measles. Lee said, "I'm most concerned that Florida Surgeon General will relay misinformation." Or you can use the free Central Florida Public Media app and choose Talk Back from the menu to record your comment or question. Our show last week about cursive prompted Mimi to share a childhood experience about her cursive writing.
My name is Mimi. I live in Longwood, and I remember taking cursive writing, a long time ago, and they did teach it, but I remember my teacher, Mrs. Hennessy, gave me F because I was writing in what she called backhanded. Glance of my letters were wrong, so my mom went in and said, "This is how she writes," and Mrs. Hennessy changed her mind and then didn't give me Fs anymore.
And here's a text number you can save to use anytime you want to comment or share a story idea. 833-793-8633. Next week, we'll speak with Amy Pauley, head coach of the Orlando Valkyries, Central Florida's professional women's volleyball team, who happens to be dominating their league. We want to hear your questions about professional volleyball and the players representing the City Beautiful. You can share those questions with us at engage@cfpublic.org. It's spring and romance is in the air and in the pages of the books at the New Romantics bookstore in Audubon Park. We will visit owner Jane Rodriguez to talk about romance and literature. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. 30 years ago, when someone mentioned romance literature, probably referred to some type of pulpy novel with an illustration of a Fabio-looking man gripping a wild-eyed woman whose clothes always seem to be a bit torn. You know what I'm talking about. Those Harlequin romance books have evolved, though, into sophisticated literature that looks at relationships through a 21st century lens and recognizes fictional characters representative of the broad spectrum of humanity that is America today. That spectrum has spawned hundreds of subgenres within romance lit, books about romance with cowboys, hockey players, billionaires, and vampires. The entire range of the LGBTQIA+ environment, if you can imagine it, there's a romance book with that as the central theme. No bookstore in Central Florida offers a selection of romance novels like Audubon Park's The New Romantics. Owner Jane Rodriguez took her passion for romance novels to the next level by opening a brick-and-mortar bookstore in an age when Amazon and Barnes & Noble are dominating the retail market. The gamble paid off thus far. The New Romantics has developed a loyal customer base, and Rodriguez has emerged as the national leader in the romance-lit retail industry. The romance genre will be recognized this weekend in Winter Park as the Romancing the Books Festival takes place Saturday at the Edith Bush Theater. The New Romantics bookstore is one of the festival sponsors, and yesterday, Engage stopped by to meet Jane Rodriguez and learn more about this growing genre. So I need to know, what about romance drew you in initially?
So I have been a romance reader my whole life, and exclusively romance. I think that is really important. There has never been a genre that has quite done it for me like romance has. And ever since I was a teenager, and I think for a lot of us that grew up with like Twilight, for example, we've kind of evolved into these avid romance readers and have kind of like shaped a community around it. So my love of romance has just been like reinforced the older that I've gotten and the more like online social media involvement I've had. And I think that things like Instagram and TikTok have been massive to shaping myself as a reader, because I went from reading like 30 romance books a year to 130 books a year in all romance. And there's so many people that feel the same way, which is really cool because we've created like a really amazing community over the things that we love and happy ever afters, and knowing that when you pick up a romance book, there's going to be a happy ending. I think there's something so like satisfying reading that going in, knowing that like this is going to be a good time no matter what.
Is it a release, like an escape almost?
Sure. I think that a lot of us use it as an escape, and it's just so fun. Like, I forget what that quote is, but it says something along the lines of like, every book you read, you're like living 1,000 lives, because you get to like immerse yourself. And I think that the romance genre has really exploded in the different like subgenres that it's gotten into. So for example, I'm a massive romantasy reader, which is romance and fantasy. So things that had to do with magic and fae and powers, and the stakes are just like so much higher, and every time I'm reading one of those, I just really immerse myself in the world. So that is just such a fun place to go to, and it's also become like a safe space almost. Like, I've had my comfort reads where I will reread them over and over again because it just feels so safe and comfortable to like step back into that world and have that escape.
I'm wondering what you would say to someone who, when they think of a romance novel, they get an image of their head of Fabio or some sculpted man with his hair flowing in the wind.
Yeah, I think that that is the stigma that romance has followed for a very, very long time. And I think that recently people have just become like, have done away with the shame that they have with that. And I think that the space for romance bookstores is so important because we're able to create that safe space for people that are not going to come in and judge people based off of the things that they're reading. And I can go on a whole tangent about romance books specifically, and how romance books are only being shamed because it's the things that women love, the same way that like Taylor Swift fans are being like judged for being too passionate, but like sports fans are encouraged to have so much love for the things that they're doing. So it's just, if you come in with the misconception that romance is just that Fabio on the cover, you're barely scratching the surface as to what romance really is. And there's just so much more like depth to romance, and so much fun and joy for it too.
So I've just walked into the new Romantics bookstore. There are stacks and shelves of books. Mm-hmm. I'm new to romance. Where do I even start?
Yeah, I would say contemporary romance is always a good place to start, because it's just going to be a fun time, and there's so many different types of stories that you can get into, and there's so many incredible authors that we can definitely find you a book for me to recommend to you. And then our team members do a really amazing job of having like the book review plaques. So if you're just like reading like, oh, I don't know where to begin, if there's a plaque on it, that's because a team member felt like passionately enough about it that they wanted to encourage that to someone that was reading. So I definitely say contemporary romance. And a really big thing too is like the spice level, right? Is how spicy a book is. So those are things that you can see on the reviews. There's little like chili peppers to kind of like indicate the spice level of what you'll find in that specific book.
What are some of the more obscure genres maybe that I haven't heard of within romance?
Yeah. So there's so many subgenres, and that's actually how we have our store organized. So if you look on the shelves, we have our contemporary romances, which is the majority of the romances that are being released now, which are just the stories that are happening nowadays. And like, there's so many niche genres that fall into that. So you can have your cowboy romances, your billionaire romances, your workplace romances. Like, there's literally just an endless amount of different types that you can get in the contemporary subgenre. There's sports romance, which also falls under that. So we have our hockey romances, basketball, like golf, anything you can think of, really. There's LGBTQ romances, romantasy, how I mentioned. Dark romance is one that is making a big appearance lately. So is paranormal romance. So vampires, witches, werewolves, stuff like that is really cool. We also have historical romance and then young adult as well.
You mentioned LGBTQ romance.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been a growing market focused on inclusivity? Do we see authors talking about race, class, ethnicity, and modern romance.
Yes, for sure. And I will say that that is a really big priority for us in this space as well. I'm a Latina myself, so I want to try to uplift the story of diverse authors as much as possible. So if you look on our shelves also, a lot of the books that we have outward facing, which are the books that are seen the most, are books by authors of color, and we have 2 whole shelves dedicated to queer and LGBTQ romances alone, because people really want to see themselves in the romance stories that they're reading, and we are just really like happy to be able to champion all of those stories and be able to like lift authors and these different subgenres up.
Jane, who is reading this romance literature? What would surprise me about who's walking into the store?
I don't know if it'd be much of a surprise, honestly. I would say women 18 to 70, basically, if not older, are our ideal demographic. Every once in a while, we do see men come in, which is really exciting, and I think it's great when they're able to celebrate that with us. But I don't think there's much of a surprise as to who's walking in our door.
Is there something that men can learn about romance from these books?
100%, 100%. I would dare say that some of these books can even be like a training manual for guys, because I think one of the things that's really cool about romances and the stories that they tell is that the way that they love each other, right? And I think there's a saying that's pretty popular in the world as women, where it's like if he wanted to, he would. So it has like all of these men in these stories have grand gestures that aren't necessarily grand. It's just like declaring your love or showing compassion and empathy or helping them in ways that like maybe women aren't used to. And I think that romance books do a really cool way of showing just how women want to be loved and treated, and even the smallest of things can go such a long way.
I know we're obviously talking about books, but it also reminds me of why people love just like romantic comedies, a Hallmark Channel, just loving love.
Yeah, it's so feel good, you know, and I think that goes back to the romance genre. So a book that classifies itself as a romance is that it has to end in a happily ever after. That's kind of like the requirement of the genre. And what separates romance from like literary fiction is that it has that happily ever after. So people can come into the store and expect that the book that they're going to read is going to end in a happily ever after. So whatever like issues or problems they go through in the book, by the end of it, it's going to come to a pretty like satisfying conclusion of just happiness.
Can you tell me about an event coming up? You're one of the hosts with the Winter Park Library of the Romancing the Book Festival this weekend. What can we expect?
Yeah, we're so excited for that event. We're going to be featuring 9 different authors. So it's going to happen this Saturday, March 29th from 1 to 5 at the Winter Park Library. It's going to start off with a keynote with Sonali Dev, which is an amazing author. She has a whole like series of books that are Jane Austen retellings, which is really exciting, especially because this year marks the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen, which that just blows my mind. I always say that Jane Austen's like the OG of romance. So romance has been around for 250 years at this point, which is wild. So we have a keynote with Sonali, and then we are going to have sort of like a marketplace style where folks are going to be able to come and engage with all of our authors, get books signed, learn more about their books, engage with us as a bookstore, and just have a really fun day romancing the books and celebrating romance.
Jane Rodriguez owns the New Romantics bookstore in Audubon Park in Orlando. They'll have a pop-up bookstore at the Winter Park Library's Romancing the Books Festival. That's Saturday, March 29th from 1 to 5. There will also be an author panel, book signings, and giveaways. We'll have links to the event on our webpage, cfpublic.org.
I wonder who wrote the book out loud.
Hey, are you a fan of romance literature? We want to hear from you. Who are your favorite authors? What type of romance genre makes you blush? Let us know by sending us an email to engage@cfpublic.org. That's all for today's edition of Engage. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us.